Imagine a world where death was a mystery that arrived on the wind, in a cup of water, or through the invisible prick of a needle. In the mid-19th century, humanity was fighting a war against an enemy it couldn't see, couldn't name, and certainly couldn't defeat. Surgeons moved from autopsies to childbeds without washing their hands, believing that disease was caused by miasma, bad air, or that life simply spontaneously generated from decaying matter. Then came Louis Pasteur. He wasn't a doctor. He was a chemist, a man obsessed with the behavior of crystals and the fermentation of beetroot alcohol. Yet, from his cramped laboratory, he would dismantle centuries of medical ignorance, proving that invisible germs were the true masters of life and death. He saved the French wine and silk industries, gave us the process that bears his name, pasteurization, and developed the world's first lab-created vaccines. He was the secular saint of France, a hero of the Enlightenment whose name became synonymous with the triumph of reason over superstition. But behind the polished marble statues and the hagiographic biographies lies a much darker, more complicated reality. For over a century, Pasteur's private laboratory notebooks were kept under lock and key, hidden from the public by his family, until they were finally released in the late 20th century. What they revealed was a man far removed from the selfless saint of legend. These notes show a ruthless competitor who frequently distorted his data to claim priority over rivals, a man who broke the most basic rules of medical ethics, and a scientist who conducted high-stakes experiments on human subjects, including a 9-year-old boy, using methods that were significantly less proven than he led the world to believe. Today, we are exploring the dual legacy of the Pasteur dynasty, the visionary who paved the way for modern medicine, and the secretive egoist who played a dangerous game of God with human lives to secure his place in the history books. The story begins in the 1840s, in the heart of industrializing France. Pasteur didn't start his career trying to cure diseases. He started it by trying to understand why some wine turned into vinegar and why some beer went sour. At the time, the spontaneous generation theory was the gold standard of science. It suggested that if you left meat out, maggots and bacteria simply appeared out of nothingness. Pasteur found this idea offensive, not just scientifically, but religiously. He was convinced that life only comes from life. Through his famous swan neck flask experiments, he proved that if you boiled a liquid to kill the microbes and then prevented dust from entering, the liquid would stay pure forever. It was a simple, elegant proof that changed everything. If microbes didn't just appear out of thin air, then they could be tracked, they could be blocked, and they could be killed. This discovery wasn't just academic, it was worth millions. The French wine industry was in a state of collapse, with entire vintages turning into undrinkable sludge. Pasteur swooped in and showed the vintners that by heating the wine just enough to kill the bacteria without ruining the flavor, they could preserve their product. This was the birth of pasteurization. He did the same for the silk industry, identifying the parasites killing the silkworms and saving thousands of French jobs. By the 1870s, Pasteur was a national hero, a man who had used the power of the microscope to save the French economy. But as his fame grew, so did his obsession with being first. He wasn't content with saving industries. He wanted to conquer the ultimate frontier, human disease. The transition from chemist to medical pioneer was where the legend began to diverge from the laboratory notes. Pasteur's greatest rival was a German doctor named Robert Koch, who had identified the specific bacteria that caused anthrax. The race was on to find a way to prevent it. Pasteur claimed he had developed a weakened version of the anthrax germ that could act as a vaccine, a term he coined in honor of Edward Jenner's work with vaca, cows. In a spectacular public demonstration at a farm in Paola-le-Fort, Pasteur vaccinated 24 sheep, 1 goat, and several cows. He then exposed them to a lethal dose of anthrax. 2 days later, a crowd of journalists and skeptics gathered to find all the vaccinated animals healthy, while the unvaccinated ones lay dead in the dirt. It was a public relations masterpiece that solidified his status as a miracle worker. However, the private notebooks tell a different story. In his public reports, Pasteur claimed he had created the vaccine by exposing the bacteria to oxygen. In reality, he had used a chemical process, potassium bichromate, a method actually pioneered by his rival, Jean-Joseph Henri Toussaint. Pasteur had essentially used someone else's recipe, kept it a secret, and then lied about his own process to ensure he got the patent and the prestige. This pattern of secrecy and professional borrowing would reach its terrifying climax when Pasteur turned his attention to the most feared disease of the 19th century, rabies. Unlike anthrax, rabies was a death sentence, a slow, agonizing descent into madness and hydrophobia. To solve it, Pasteur would have to step out of the world of sheep and into a moral gray zone that would haunt his legacy for a century. By the 1880s, rabies was the stuff of nightmares. It was a disease that turned the family dog into a monster and a human being into a thrashing, hydrophobic wreck. While Pasteur had found success with anthrax in livestock, rabies was different. It was a virus, something even smaller than bacteria, which meant Pasteur couldn't even see his enemy under the microscopes of the day. But his lack of visual evidence didn't slow his ambition. In his laboratory, he began a gruesome process of serial passage, infecting rabbits with the disease, harvesting their spinal cords, and drying them to weaken the virus. He was essentially trying to create a biological dimmer switch for death. His public stance was one of supreme confidence, but his private notebooks, sealed away for decades, reveal a man haunted by the gaps in his own knowledge. He was terrified that his weakened virus might actually trigger the very disease he was trying to prevent. The tension between the public hero and the private experimenter reached its breaking point on July 6, 1885. A 9-year-old boy named Joseph Meister was brought to Pasteur's lab after being bitten 14 times by a rabid dog. Under the medical ethics of the time, and certainly by modern standards, Pasteur was in a legal and moral minefield. He was not a licensed physician. He was a chemist. Injecting a human being with an experimental substance was, technically, a crime. But Pasteur saw a golden opportunity. If he saved the boy, he would be a god. If the boy died, he was already destined to die from the dog bites anyway. Over several days, Pasteur injected Meister with increasingly potent doses of his experimental vaccine. The boy survived, and the world erupted in celebration. Pasteur was hailed as the man who had conquered the dread dog sickness. However, the hidden notebooks tell a story of staggering recklessness. They reveal that before Joseph Meister ever walked through the door, Pasteur had already secretly attempted to treat other human subjects with disastrous or inconclusive results. He had tried to treat a man named Gerard and a young girl named Rosadel Pelequin, but his notes on these cases were self-contradictory and conveniently omitted from his official reports to the Academy of Sciences. Even more shocking, the notes show that when he treated Meister, Pasteur hadn't actually completed the necessary animal trials to prove his specific weakening method was safe for humans. He was essentially winging it on a child's life, driven by a desperate need to beat his competitors to the finish line of medical history. He gambled with the boy's life, won, and then carefully edited the story to make it look like a calculated scientific certainty rather than a frantic, high-stakes roll of the dice. This obsession with his own image defined the Pasteur dynasty in the years that followed. He became a master of what we would now call spin. He founded the Pasteur Institute in 1888, creating a global network of scientific power that remains a titan of research today. But inside the institute, he ruled with an iron fist. He demanded absolute loyalty and insisted that all data go through him before publication. He was known to berate assistants who questioned his findings and was famously litigious against anyone who challenged his priority on a discovery. His family continued this protective streak long after his death in 1895, carefully curating his papers and preventing historians from seeing the raw data of his experiments. They knew that the saint of science was a more powerful legacy than the flawed chemist. As the 20th century dawned, the myth of Pasteur was so strong that it became a cornerstone of French national identity. To question Pasteur was to question France itself. His methods, even the ethically dubious ones, had undoubtedly saved millions of lives. He had laid the groundwork for the eradication of smallpox, the control of polio, and the modern understanding of hygiene. But the release of his notebooks in the 1990s forced a global reckoning. Historians like Gerald Geison, who spent years deciphering Pasteur's cramped handwriting, showed that Pasteur had frequently engaged in pious frauds, small lies intended to support a larger, true conclusion. It raised a haunting question that the scientific community is still grappling with. Does a life-saving result justify a dishonest process? The final act of the Pasteur saga isn't just about the man. It's about the standard he set for the great man of science. The Pasteur dynasty taught us to look for heroes in white coats, but it also taught us that those heroes are often driven by the same ego, greed, and tribalism as anyone else. Today, the Pasteur Institute is at the forefront of fighting COVID-19 and Ebola, standing as a monument to his genius. But the ghost of those private notebooks reminds us that science is a human endeavor, prone to human error and human vanity. Pasteur's real legacy isn't that he was perfect. It's that he was right about the germs, even when he was wrong about the ethics. Looking back, Louis Pasteur remains one of the most significant figures in human history. He transformed the world from a place of invisible miasmas into a world of identifiable pathogens. He gave us the tools to double the human lifespan. But the dynasty he left behind is a cautionary tale. It tells us that we must separate the science from the scientist. We can admire the vaccine while acknowledging the recklessness of the man who held the needle. In the end, Pasteur's notes didn't diminish his discoveries, but they did humanize him. He was a man who stared into the microscopic abyss and found a way to save us. But he was so afraid of the dark that he felt he had to lie about how he found the light.